I want you to take a second and just look around wherever you are right now.
Right, just take a quick scan.
Yeah, look for anything made of rubber. I mean, maybe you are sitting in your car, right? So your hands are gripping the steering wheel and you're rolling down the road on 4 massive tires.
Or maybe you're out for a run and you can, feel the bounce of the rubber soles on your sneakers hitting the pavement.
Exactly. Or honestly, maybe there's just a simple, tiny rubber band sitting on the desk right in front of you. It is basically one of the most invisible, mundane materials in our daily lives.
We completely take it for granted.
We do. We just expect it to be there. We never really think about it. But today, well, we're going to ask you to think really deeply about it.
Because the global hunger for this single everyday commodity, it didn't just, help build the modern world.
Right. It acted as the catalyst for some of the darkest, honestly most unfathomable chapters of mass violence in modern history.
It really did.
Yeah.
And strangely enough, at the exact same time, it birthed the very concept of international human rights activism.
It is such a wild contradiction.
It's a profound historical contradiction, yeah. I mean, the material that literally cushioned our ride into the 20th century, the stuff that insulated our early telegraph wires and, gave us the entire automobile industry, it was initially harvested through systems of almost incomprehensible brutality.
So we are looking at a massive intersecting historical dossier today. And our mission for this deep dive is to trace an evolution.
Specifically, we're going to look at the global corporate extraction model.
Right. We'll start in the late 19th century with King Leopold II's absolute personal ownership of the Congo.
And we will trace that unbroken lineage all the way to the 1990s. We'll be examining how an American tire company ended up, entangled in a brutal civil war in Liberia.
Okay, let's unpack this right from the start, because I like to think of this as a very dark, very twisted corporate evolutionary tree.
That's a good way to put it.
Thanks. I mean, if the modern business supply chains that you and I interact with today, the overnight shipping, the seamless logistics, those polished corporate social responsibility reports, if those are the leaves on the branches, this deep dive is digging all the way down into the roots.
Right. We are looking at exactly how global resource extraction was systematized in the first place.
And what's crucial to understand up front is that this isn't just like a simple history of bad actors or evil men doing evil things.
I mean, though there is certainly plenty of that in the historical record.
Oh, absolutely. But it is fundamentally a study of the systemic logic of extraction. It's about how foreign capital interacts with local power to just, secure a resource.
Right. And sometimes that local power is a royal decree enforced by a literal private army.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is sanitized, heavily managed corporate company town.
And sometimes, well, it's corporate protection payments made to armed rebel groups in an active war zone.
The mechanism changes, right?
Yeah.
It adapts over time. But the underlying logic of keeping the commodity flowing is shockingly consistent.
So by the time we finish this journey, I genuinely think the way you view corporate accountability, the way you view supply chains, and honestly, the way you view the global economy as a whole, it's going to be fundamentally rewired.
I completely agree.
So I know we need to go back to the beginning here. Where does this story actually start?
It starts in a conference room in 1885, the Berlin Conference.
Okay.
This is where the major European powers essentially sat around a massive map and, negotiated the carving up of the African continent.
Which is just a wild concept to begin with.
It's completely arrogant, yeah. But what happens with the Congo territory is a massive historical anomaly. I mean, it defies almost every conventional understanding we have of colonialism.
Wait, how is it an anomaly? Because when I think of that era, I just picture European empires claiming territory. The British Empire, the French Empire. Wasn't the Congo just a Belgian colony?
So that is the most common misconception. The Congo Free State was absolutely not a Belgian colony at that time.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the Belgian government, as a democratic state, actually didn't want a colony. The parliament thought it would be a massive financial drain, just a terrible investment.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
Right, so King Leopold II, the King of Belgium, he maneuvered diplomatically as a private citizen.
As a private citizen, he's the king.
I know, it's wild. He played the European powers against each other. He convinced them that he would run the territory as this, humanitarian and free trade zone.
A humanitarian zone, right.
The result was that he acquired the Congo territory as his own personal private property.
Okay, I need to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. You're saying one man, a single European monarch, became the sole sovereign owner of a landmass roughly the size of Western Europe.
Exact.
Not his country, but him personally.
Yes. Imagine a single CEO owning an entire nation-state as a private LLC.
That is insane.
It is the absolute enclave, a whole country run as a private concession. And Leopold never once even set foot in the territory.
He never went there.
Never. He ran it from his palaces in Brussels, and initially, his agents were primarily extracting ivory. But then, the global economy underwent this massive shift.
Right, the technology boom. We get the bicycle craze in the 1890s.
Yes.
And John Dunlop invents the pneumatic tire, which is basically, an inflatable rubber tube. Suddenly, the automobile industry is being born. Electrical wires need insulation.
Exactly.
And all of these massive technological leaps require one specific thing, rubber.
Yes, but specifically wild rubber. This is a really crucial distinction.
Okay, how so?
Well, wild rubber isn't like harvesting wheat or corn. You don't just clear a field, plant seeds, and, wait a season for a crop.
Right.
In the Congo Basin, rubber came from massive vines, species like Landolphia, that wound their way high into the jungle canopy.
So it's not even a tree you can just tap easily.
No, harvesting it was dangerous, incredibly labor-intensive work. Workers had to climb hundreds of feet into the trees, slash the vines, and literally coat their own bodies in the sap so it would coagulate.
Oh, man.
Yeah, and then they had to painfully peel it off their skin.
That sounds horrific. So you have this exploding global demand, an absolute frenzy for rubber, and King Leopold finds himself privately owning a territory overflowing with the supply.
Exactly.
But to get it out of a dense jungle, he needs immense amounts of labor. How does a single guy in Brussels mobilize millions of people across a continent he's never even visited?
Well, his solution was to monetize the forced labor of the Congolese people.
Just legally mandate it.
Basically. He did this by issuing decrees that declared all, quote-unquote, vacant land, and its resources belonged directly to him.
Oh.
He then deployed state agents and granted monopolies to these massive privately funded concession companies. A prime example is the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company, or ABIR.
Right, I saw them mentioned a lot in the dossier.
Right. Yeah, these companies were given free rein to extract as much rubber as possible, as fast as possible.
And this is where, looking at the historical sources, the extraction mechanism turns into an absolute nightmare.
It really does.
Because you can't just politely ask villagers to abandon their farms, walk deep into a dangerous forest, climb 100 feet in the air, and harvest sap all day for no pay.
No, people won't do that.
So to force them to do this, the regime implemented a system of absolute terror.
That's right. The enforcement mechanism was a private military force called the Force Publique.
Okay.
They were ostensibly a gendarmerie, like a police force. But in practice, they were the enforcers of a brutal rubber quota system.
And the quota system was really the engine of the horror here.
Completely. Every village in a rubber-producing district was assigned a staggering amount of rubber they had to deliver to the state or company agents every couple of weeks.
And what happened if they didn't meet the quota? Because, the vines were getting depleted, right? People had to walk further and further into the jungle just to find rubber.
Yeah, it became harder and harder to find. And if a village failed to meet that quota, the Force Publique would descend. And their tactics were entirely systemic.
Meaning this wasn't just random acts of violence.
Exactly. This wasn't random violence. It was a highly calibrated strategy of coercion. They would routinely take hostages, very often the women of the village, holding them in horrific, squalid conditions until the men returned with enough rubber to secure their release.
That's just so calculated.
It gets worse. If a village resisted entirely, or if the local vines were completely dry and they physically couldn't get the rubber, the troops would burn the village to the ground and commit mass killings to set an example for the surrounding region.
And out of this specific systemic violence comes what is probably the most infamous, chilling symbol of Leopold's Congo, the severing of hands.
Yes.
I have to say, when I was reading through the sources for this, trying to understand why this specific practice started, it is horrifying on a level I just wasn't prepared for.
It's very difficult to read about.
Because it wasn't just arbitrary sadism, was it? It was rooted in, accounting.
It is perhaps the darkest example of bureaucratic logic in modern history.
Explain that, because it's hard to wrap your head around.
So, the officers of the Force Publique were mostly white Europeans commanding conscripted African soldiers.
Okay.
And the administration was obsessed with cutting costs. Ammunition was expensive to ship all the way from Europe, and the commanders wanted to ensure that the soldiers weren't, wasting bullets hunting animals for food.
Right.
Or worse, stockpiling weapons to stage a mutiny against the European officers. So they instituted a strict rule. They demanded a receipt for every single bullet fired.
And that receipt was a severed right hand.
Yes. To prove that a bullet had been used to kill a so-called rebel or someone resisting the rubber quota, a soldier had to produce the severed right hand of the victim.
It is the absolute definition of a dystopian corporate ledger.
It really is.
You have mid-level managers demanding human hands to prove they were managing company resources efficiently. But, if you think about it logically, soldiers miss. In a firefight, you're going to use more bullets than you get kills.
Of course.
Or maybe a soldier did use a bullet to hunt an animal just to survive. How did they balance the books?
To balance the books, soldiers would cut the hands off the living.
Oh my God.
Yeah. If an expedition returned with fewer hands than bullets spent, the soldiers themselves would face severe punishment. So the practice morphed from an accounting mechanism into a standalone tool of mass terror.
So they were just collecting hands to meet a quota of hands.
Exactly. Baskets of smoked hands were literally brought to the colonial river stations to prove to the managers that quotas were being enforced. It just became a currency of violence.
I want to pause here and ask a question because this really gets into the psychology of how global businesses operate. If King Leopold is sitting comfortably in Brussels, throwing lavish parties, funding massive public works projects in Belgium with this rubber money, how much of this was his personal direct sadism versus a system functioning exactly as its incentives dictated?
That's the key question.
Like, did he write a memo saying, go chop off hands?
Historians generally agree he didn't write a memo explicitly ordering mutilation.
Right.
But he built an incentive structure with zero ethical constraints, absolute impunity, and astronomical profit targets.
He just wanted the numbers to go up.
Exactly. He demanded margins that were physically impossible to achieve without extreme coercion.
Yeah.
He paid his agents commissions based on how much rubber they collected and how cheaply they acquired it.
So the cruelty was baked in.
The system functioned exactly as it was designed to function. When you demand infinite growth from a finite resource using unpaid labor, well, violence isn't a glitch. It is a necessary externality of the business model.
Okay, but this is happening in the late 19th and early 20th century. There is no internet. There are no satellite images showing burned villages. There are no global watchdogs like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch.
None of that existed.
It seems impossible to hide an atrocity happening across an area the size of Western Europe. But it was largely working, wasn't it?
It was. Leopold controlled the narrative beautifully. He claimed he was bringing civilization and Christianity to the continent.
So how did the world finally find out what was really happening?
It started with a shipping clerk looking at a spreadsheet.
Really? A shipping clerk?
Or, well, more accurately, shipping manifests. In the late 1890s, a man named E.D. Morel was working for the Elder Dempster shipping line in the port of Antwerp, Belgium.
Okay.
His company had the monopoly on transport to and from the Congo Free State. And Morel's job was basically to stand on the docks and log the cargo.
And Morel has what we can only call a spreadsheet epiphany.
That's a great way to describe it.
Tell me how he figures this out just by looking at boxes on a dock.
Well, he starts noticing a terrifying, undeniable imbalance in the trade statistics. Ship after ship is arriving from the Congo loaded with massive, staggering fortunes in raw rubber and ivory.
So huge amounts of wealth coming in.
Huge amounts.
Yeah.
But when he looks at the manifests for what is being shipped back to the Congo on the return voyage, it isn't currency.
Oh, okay.
It isn't commercial trade goods or machinery or textiles that you would expect in a normal, functioning trade relationship.
What was it?
It's almost entirely military supplies, crates of rifles, millions of rounds of ammunition, and chains.
Man, if you're listening to this, put yourself in Morel's shoes for a second. You're looking at a ledger, millions of dollars of value coming out, nothing but guns going in. What does that actually mean in economic terms?
Well, Morel realized that if nothing of value is going into the country, the people extracting the rubber aren't being paid.
Right.
There is no commercial transaction happening. He deduced the atrocity entirely from the trade statistics.
Just from the numbers.
Just from the numbers. He realized that the only way to extract that volume of wealth without exchanging commercial goods was through a massive, systemic, state-sponsored regime of forced labor.
That is incredible investigative work.
He essentially proved the coercion before anyone had widely photographed the victims.
But when we talk about the victims, we enter into a deeply contested, highly complex area of history. We need to talk about the death toll.
We do.
Yeah.
And we have to approach this with extreme care because a precise number is completely unknowable.
Why is that?
Because there was no widespread, accurate census taken in the Congo before Leopold took it over in 1885. So historians and historical demographers are forced to rely on modeling, looking at later data, colonial records, and contemporary accounts of the devastation.
And the numbers they arrive at, even at the most conservative end, are just staggering.
They are.
The broad scholarly consensus is that over this roughly 23-year period of Leopold's rule, the population of the Congo was reduced by roughly half.
Half of the population gone.
And when scholars try to put an absolute number on that percentage, the estimates range widely, right?
Very widely. Some demographers cite a few million dead. Others, like the historian Adam Huckchild in his highly influential book King Leopold's Ghost, well, he estimates the loss at around 10 million people.
10 million people.
Yeah.
If you were listening to this and wondering, like, how do millions of people just disappear from the historical record without a census? How do scholars actually figure this out? Because it wasn't all just people shot by the force public, right?
No, direct murder was only one factor. Demographers look at what happens when a population is subjected to this level of systemic terror, leading to a total demographic collapse.
What does that look like on the ground?
Well, when the force public attacked, people fled deep into the inhospitable jungles to escape the rubber quotas. Separated from their farms and food sources, massive numbers simply starved.
Oh, wow.
And with no one left to cultivate crops, widespread famine set in across the entire region. Diseases, particularly sleeping sickness, swept through these newly weakened, displaced populations with devastating lethality.
Because their immune systems were compromised.
Exactly. And crucially, the birth rate absolutely plunged. The social fabric required to sustain life was completely dismantled by the extraction model.
This brings up a major scholarly debate that I saw repeatedly in the dossier.
Yes.
The framing debate between categorizing this as a genocide versus an atrocity or a regime of labor terror. Why is there debate about what to call it? Doesn't 10 million dead speak for itself?
It does, but this raises an important question about how we categorize historical horrors, particularly in the realm of international law. By the modern UN definition, genocide is the intentional, systematic extermination of a specific national, ethnic, racial, or religious group.
Okay, the intent is the key part.
The intent to destroy the group is key. Many scholars argue that Leopold's regime, horrific as it was, didn't harbor the specific intent to wipe out the Congolese people.
Right.
From a purely cynical perspective, dead people can't climb vines and harvest rubber.
That's grim but true.
They argue it was a forced labor regime of unprecedented, impossibly violent proportions, where the massive loss of life was a byproduct of the extraction process, not the primary ideological goal.
I understand the legal distinction, but I have to ask, to the millions who died of starvation or violence, does it actually matter if it was intentional extermination or just a byproduct of a rubber quota?
A fair question.
Like, is that just a historical technicality we use to neatly categorize and maybe sanitize corporate violence?
It is a totally valid question. I mean, from the perspective of the victims, the outcome, the demographic destruction of their society was identical.
Right.
However, historians argue the distinction matters deeply for understanding the mechanisms of global capital.
How so?
Well, understand the motive that this devastation was driven by a demand for profit margins and cheap resources rather than pure ethnic hatred. It helps us recognize the specific, systemic danger of unchecked corporate extraction.
Oh, I see.
It tells us what systems of capital are capable of when entirely divorced from oversight in human rights.
And that concept, international human rights, is basically about to be invented out of this exact crisis.
Yes, it is.
Because Morel had the shipping numbers, but as we know today, data alone rarely changes the world. People can easily ignore spreadsheets.
They do it all the time.
To force a European king to give up a country, they needed irrefutable proof. They needed an eyewitness.
Which brings us to a fascinating figure, Roger Casement.
Yes, Roger Casement.
He was a British consul, a diplomat serving in Africa. In 1904, the British government, feeling mounting public pressure fueled partly by Morel's writings, officially commissioned Casement to investigate the persistent rumors swirling around the Congo interior.
Casement is such an interesting guy to read about. I look at him like a modern-day international whistleblower or, a UN human rights inspector, but he's operating decades before those frameworks or job titles even existed.
Right.
And he doesn't just sit in a colonial office reading reports, does he?
No, his methodology was revolutionary for the time. He hired his own boat and traveled directly into the remote rubber districts of the Upper Congo River.
He went right to the source.
He bypassed the official state tours entirely. He went into the interior, interviewed villagers directly, and meticulously documented the quota coercion, the hostage-taking, and the mutilations firsthand.
And he puts all of this together.
Yeah, he compiled this evidence into what became known as the 1904 Casement Report, a devastating, highly detailed document laid before the British Parliament.
And then Casement and Morrell team up, right?
You do. They officially found the Congo Reform Association, the CRA. This is widely considered by historians to be the first large-scale international human rights campaign in modern history.
What's fascinating here is the blueprint they created for modern activism. It's essentially the exact same playbook used by NGOs today.
It really is. They used the media to their advantage. They held massive public rallies across Europe and the United States.
I read they used magic lantern shows.
Yeah, early slide projectors, to show audiences horrifying photographs of the victims. And crucially, they recruited the celebrity influencers of their day.
Right. They get Mark Twain, who writes an incredibly biting satirical pamphlet called King Leopold's Soliloquy.
Yes.
They get Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, to write a book condemning the regime. They mobilized massive public outrage to put pressure on Western governments.
And the pressure campaign worked. The international outcry became so intense and the public relations disaster so severe that by 1908, the Belgian government was forced to formally intervene.
So they take it away from Leopold.
They essentially stripped King Leopold of his personal ownership, annexed the territory, and it finally became the Belgian Congo.
Right.
Now, to be clear, this absolutely did not end colonial exploitation or forced labor in the Congo.
Of course not.
But it did break the absolute unchecked terror of the private enclave model.
So Casement exposes the Congo, Leopold loses his private country, and international human rights are born. Does Casement just retire an activist hero? Because reading the dossier, his story takes a very dark, very global turn.
He definitely doesn't retire.
Right.
The British government realizes they have a uniquely skilled investigator. And a few years later, in 1910, they send him somewhere completely different.
Where to?
Across the Atlantic to South America. Specifically, the Putumayo region of the Amazon basin.
Wait, why is a British diplomat investigating the Amazon? What was happening over there?
It was another rubber boom.
Ah, of course.
A company called the Peruvian Amazon Company, run by a local rubber baron named Julio Cesar Arana, had registered its board of directors in London to attract British capital.
Okay, so there's a British connection.
Right. Because it was a British-registered company, the government had jurisdiction to investigate persistent rumors of atrocities against the local indigenous populations. So Casement travels deep into the Amazon.
And what does he find there? Because the environment is different, the continent is different.
He finds the exact same blueprint of violence he saw in the Congo.
Really? The exact same?
In a completely different continent, different corporate actors, a different indigenous population, but the identical coercion by quota model.
Wow.
The local indigenous people were being forced to harvest wild rubber through a system of severe debt bondage and physical terror. Casement documented the same systemic hostage-taking, horrific torture, starvation, and mass death.
It has to be the profound tragedy of Casement's life.
It must have been devastating.
He realizes that what happened in the Congo wasn't just the result of a uniquely evil Belgian king. It was the systemic nature of wild rubber extraction itself.
Exactly.
It's the math.
Yeah.
If you want a difficult-to-harvest wild commodity, and you want it fast and cheap with maximum profit, this violent coercion is the system that capital naturally gravitates toward when there is no oversight.
Exactly. Casement's dual investigations in the Congo and the Amazon solidify something monumental for our understanding of global economics.
Right.
They expose the fact that foreign capital, operating in remote areas, will default to terror to secure profit. His exhaustive reports lay the intellectual, moral, and investigative foundation for the modern international human rights framework.
But his exposure of these systems changes the game for the corporations too, right?
Absolutely.
Because the outrage over the Congo and the Putumayo atrocities forced a massive shift in the global corporate model. Corporations looked at these massive public relations disasters, the boycotts, the parliamentary inquiries.
And they realized they couldn't rely on wild extraction and overt mass murder anymore.
It was too unstable.
It was too messy. They needed something sanitized. They needed to control the land of the workers directly in a way that looked legitimate and modern.
Which leads us to the next evolutionary leap in the extraction blueprint, the transition from the chaotic terror of wild rubber to the highly controlled, cultivated plantation model.
Yes.
To see this, we move forward in time to 1926, and we cross the ocean back to West Africa, specifically to the Sovereign Republic of Liberia. Enter the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company. This is an American corporate giant driven by Harvey Firestone, who is, desperate to break the British and Dutch monopolies on plantation rubber in Asia.
He needed his own supply.
Exactly. So in 1926, Firestone negotiates a deal with the Liberian government that is almost hard to comprehend in its sheer scale. They sign a 99-year lease for up to 1 million acres of land.
Let's really put that in perspective for you listening. 1 million acres is roughly 10% of Liberia's arable land.
10%.
Locked up for a century, dedicated to a single foreign cash crop, controlled entirely by a single foreign corporation.
Mind-blowing.
And they secured this massive tract for a token, rent literally just pennies per acre. It is widely considered by historians to be one of the most generous concessions ever granted to a private company by a sovereign nation.
And on this land, Firestone builds Harbol.
Yes.
It becomes the largest rubber plantation on the planet. But it's not just a large farm, is it? It's an entire ecosystem. It is the United Fruit Company Town model transplanted directly to West Africa.
If we contrast Harbol with Leopold Congo, the aesthetic difference is jarring.
Right. What did it look like?
Well, in the Congo, extraction was a literal war zone. At Firestone in Liberia, it was an enclave economy. It operated as a state within a state. Firestone built its own vast network of roads, its own port facilities, its own power grid, company stores, schools, and eventually hospitals.
Wow.
To an outsider or a shareholder back in Ohio, it looked like a massive, benevolent modernization project.
But let's look at the social order inside that company town, because it is intensely structurally segregated.
Very much so.
You have the American managers, white executives shipped over from the U.S. living in these well-appointed, comfortable, suburban-style compounds. They literally built a golf course.
Yeah, a golf course.
I want you to picture that. A manicured green golf course right in the middle of a West African rubber plantation.
The visual of the golf course perfectly encapsulates the dynamic, I think.
It really does. And on the other side of that stark divide, you have the Liberian tappers.
Right.
They lived in bare, tightly packed, tin-roofed shacks. And while the violent, physical terror of the Congo was gone, there were no severed hands here, the coercion of labor was still very present.
It was just formalized and economic.
Right. The tappers were bound by incredibly low wages, deeply entrenched debt at the company-owned stores where they had to buy their provisions, and strict daily tapping quotas that required exhausting physical labor.
Okay, I want to play devil's advocate here for a moment.
Go for it.
Because defenders of the Firestone model, and there are many who point to this era as a success, will point out that Firestone was the largest private employer in Liberia for decades.
That's true.
They will say, look, we brought modern medicine, we built paved roads where there were none, we brought infrastructure to a developing nation. It's pitched as a mutually beneficial arrangement.
That is the standard defense of the enclave economy, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to acknowledge those infrastructure developments.
Right.
But the historical and economic debate asks us to look at the macro level. Where did the wealth actually accumulate?
That's the real question.
The infrastructure Firestone built, the specific roads, the ports, was primarily designed for one purpose: to get raw rubber out of the country and onto ships as efficiently as possible.
It wasn't about building the nation.
No, it was not designed to build a robust, diversified Liberian economy. Critics view this as a deeply exploitative banana republic bargain. You lock up a sovereign nation's best land, you keep the labor force deliberately cheap and dependent, and the massive lion's share of the profits flows straight back to corporate headquarters in Akron, Ohio.
But if the local workers are structurally trapped by debt and quotas, and if they can't ever advance beyond a tin-roof shack while the managers are literally playing golf,
Yeah.
isn't this just a formalized, legally sanctioned version of what we saw in the Congo? The brutality is economic rather than physical.
Yeah.
But the math of the extraction cheap labor for a high-value commodity is exactly the same.
You're highlighting the exact core tension of the enclave model. It effectively replaces the whip with the wage, but the wage is kept artificially low, and the power dynamic remains absolutely asymmetrical.
The corporation holds all the cards.
Always. However, this model functions incredibly smoothly and is exceptionally profitable as long as the host country outside the gates remains politically stable.
And that right there is the pivotal caveat.
Right.
Because this sanitized, polite corporate enclave functions beautifully until the state outside its borders collapses.
And when that happens, when the neat legal framework vanishes, the corporation's true priorities are put to the ultimate test.
Which brings us to the darkest chapter of Firestone's long history in Liberia, a period rigorously investigated by modern journalists. We jump forward to the 1990s.
Okay, the 1990s.
Liberia descends into a brutal, multi-factional civil war. It's a conflict defined by extreme violence, the widespread use of child soldiers, and the total collapse of the central government in Monrovia.
And the man who launches this insurgency in 1989 is a warlord named Charles Taylor. Taylor's rebel forces begin sweeping through the countryside, and eventually they take control of the territory surrounding the massive Firestone harbor plantation.
Firestone is suddenly confronted with the ultimate crisis that defines corporate accountability in conflict zones.
They have a choice to make.
Their million-acre enclave, their massive investment, is surrounded by an armed insurgency. They essentially have two options.
What are they?
Shut down operations entirely, evacuate all personnel, abandon the massive investment, and wait for peace. Or make a deal with the armed power currently holding the guns to keep the rubber flowing.
And they chose to deal.
They did.
Let's set the scene for this, because this is where the sanitized company town completely drops its mask. It's July 1991. A meeting takes place deep in the Liberian jungle.
Picture that.
You have American corporate executives from a major recognizable tire company sitting across a table from a rebel warlord.
The intricate details of this relationship were meticulously documented in a major 2014 investigation by ProPublica and PBS Frontline.
What did they find?
Well, this investigation drew on internal corporate documents, financial ledgers, and declassified U.S. diplomatic cables. And the investigation reveals that Firestone struck a profound bargain with Taylor.
Okay.
To keep the plantation operating and the rubber exporting, Firestone agreed to channel millions of dollars in so-called taxes and direct payments to Taylor's rebel government.
Millions of dollars. But according to the investigation, it wasn't just cash changing hands, was it? They were providing material logistical support for an active war.
Precisely. The ProPublica investigation details how Firestone supplied Taylor's forces with crucial resources: food, fuel, and access to the company's vast fleet of trucks.
They gave them their trucks?
Yes. And the geographical reality of the enclave became a massive strategic asset. Because the harbor plantation was a self-contained bubble with its own communications and infrastructure, it essentially functioned as a secure rebel base from which Taylor could direct his insurgency and stage offensives.
Charles Taylor's own assessment of this arrangement is just chilling.
It is.
During a later Truth and Reconciliation hearing, he explicitly stated that Firestone provided the financial assistance needed for the revolution.
He admitted it openly.
The very same trucks that were used to haul raw rubber were being used to haul armed fighters to the front lines.
And we must trace the subsequent trajectory of Charles Taylor to fully understand the weight of this corporate bargain.
Right. What happens next?
Taylor used his military and financial advantage to prolong a devastating war, eventually forcing his way into the presidency through sheer terror.
He became president.
He then fueled further regional atrocities by spreading the conflict into neighboring Sierra Leone, backing rebels famous for amputating the limbs of civilians.
Which is just a horrific echo of the Congo.
It really is. Ultimately, in 2012, Charles Taylor became the first former head of state convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity by an international tribunal since Nuremberg.
So we have an American corporation funneling millions of dollars in strategic material support to a man who is later convicted of horrific war crimes. Now, we have to present Firestone's defense here, because they have consistently maintained their position.
We do.
They argue they operated under extreme duress. They maintained that they were caught in a chaotic, brutal war zone and had to pay extortion demands to protect their Liberian employees and safeguard their physical assets from being destroyed.
That defense forms the absolute crux of the debate over corporate culpability in the modern era. It highlights the murky distinction between being a passive victim of extortion and being an active financier of conflict.
Right.
Firestone argues they had a moral and fiduciary duty to protect their people and property on the ground. But critics, and the journalists who investigated the records, argue that by making a deliberate, highly lucrative bargain that provided millions in cash and strategic resources, Firestone crossed a profound line.
How do the critics frame it?
They frame this as active complicity, arguing they made a calculated business decision that materially funded a war criminal simply to preserve quarterly profits.
I have to pause and ask you about this because I'm trying to picture executives sitting in a boardroom in Ohio, receiving diplomatic cables or internal reports that their corporate fuel is being used in rebel offensives.
Right.
Is it really plausible for a company of that massive size with that much international leverage to claim they were just passive victims when they are handing over the literal trucks being used to wage a civil war?
It's a tough pill to swallow.
At some point, doesn't paying to protect assets just become paying to fund a war, regardless of the blood being spilled right outside the plantation gates?
That is the exact ethical and legal tension.
Hmm.
And if we zoom out and connect this to the broader global blueprint we've been tracing, we see this isn't an isolated incident.
No.
No, the underlying logic of the Firestone-Taylor relationship is structurally identical to what happened decades later with the Chiquita Banana Company in Colombia.
Oh, right, the Chiquita case.
In that case, the company paid millions to the AUC, a violent right-wing paramilitary group, to ensure their banana plantations could keep operating in a conflict zone.
So it's a pattern.
It is a consistent modern evolution of corporate behavior in extraction zones. When the state fails, you pay the armed group to keep the commodity producing.
So let's trace this whole evolutionary tree we've built today.
Okay.
We started in the late 19th century with King Leopold. He used state power and a private army to physically mutilate workers to enforce wild rubber quotas.
Yes.
The international backlash to that overt terror, spearheaded by Roger Casement, forced capital to evolve. So they moved to the company town model, like Firestone in 1926.
Right.
It looks legitimate. It has hospitals and roads. But the extraction is baked into the debt and the quotas.
And then the final evolution we discussed. When the stability of that sanitized company town is threatened by a civil war, the corporation simply pivots.
It adapts.
It adapts by funding the modern warlord to protect its assets. The overt violence is essentially outsourced to a rebel group, but the underlying goal remains exactly the same as it was in Leopold's day, the uninterrupted extraction of the commodity for the global market.
The methods modernized. We went from the horrific ledger of severed hands in the Congo to complex financial transfers and fuel logistics for a warlord in Liberia.
Yes.
But the math hasn't changed. The commodity must flow.
And the legal evolution surrounding this is equally fascinating. Think back to Roger Casement in 1904. The absolute best he could do was write a meticulous report to the British Parliament to try and publicly shame a king.
Right, he had no actual power.
He had no legal mechanism to prosecute Leopold.
Yeah.
A century later, the international legal framework has evolved to the point where a warlord like Charles Taylor is actually convicted in a war crimes court in The Hague. The human rights architecture grew teeth.
But the corporate enablers, they seem to face a much murkier reality.
They really do.
Charles Taylor goes to a maximum security prison in the UK for the rest of his life. But the executives who signed the checks for his revolution, they rarely, if ever, face that kind of international tribunal. The capital always seems to find a legal loophole.
That is the complex, enduring legacy of Casement's reform movement. The Congo Reform Association laid the groundwork for the modern international human rights framework.
Yeah.
But the Firestone example demonstrates how global capital continually adapts to operate within, or cleverly around, those very frameworks. The human rights architecture gets stronger, but the extraction models become far more sophisticated at sanitizing their operations and hiding their complicity.
This has been an absolutely staggering journey.
It covers a lot of ground.
We have gone from the wild rubber vines of the Congo and the horrific ledger of severed hands, to the manicured golf courses of Harbil, and finally to the rebel bases of Liberia.
Right.
We've seen how the insatiable demand for a single commodity-shaped national borders sparked the first human rights movements and funded devastating civil wars.
The goal of examining these two intersecting dossiers isn't just to learn historical facts or memorize dates. It is to recognize the patterns. It's to understand that the systems of extraction that built our modern world didn't just disappear when colonialism ended. They evolved, They sanitized themselves, and they adapted to new political and legal realities.
And that brings us right back to where we started. I asked you to look around at the rubber in your life, the tires on your car, the shoes on your feet.
History isn't just trapped in the past in textbooks.
No, it is physically present in the objects we use every single day.
Think about the investigations we talked about. E.D. Morel uncovered the atrocity of the Congo simply by looking closely at public shipping manifests on a dock in Antwerp.
Right.
The journalists at ProPublica uncovered the Firestone Warlord bargain by looking at declassified diplomatic cables and corporate ledgers. In both cases, a century apart, the truth was hidden in plain sight, right there in the data.
Which leaves us with a deeply unsettling question to mull over as you go about your day.
Let's hear it.
Right now, in the complex, opaque supply chains of the products sitting in your house, the lithium batteries in your phone, the fast fashion in your closet, the produce in your fridge, whose warlord bargain or whose forced quota is currently hitting inside a corporate spreadsheet, just waiting for the next investigator to look closely enough.
That is a chilling thought.
History isn't over. It's just waiting for the next audit. Thanks for taking the deep dive with us.